Dr. Kimberlé Crenshaw is a pioneering scholar and writer on civil rights, Black feminist legal theory, race, racism, and the law. She was a founder and has been a leader in the intellectual movement called critical race theory, and is also known for introducing and developing the concept of intersectionality. She is a distinguished professor of law at the University of California, Los Angeles, the Isidore and Seville Sulzbacher Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, and, as mentioned, the co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum. She writes regularly for The New Republic, The Nation, and Ms. She hosts the podcast Intersectionality Matters and has appeared as a commentator on media outlets including MSNBC and NPR. Joining her, and boy, what a treat to have met her, Dr. Richie, Beth Richie, is a distinguished professor of criminology, law, and justice and Black studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she holds the inaugural chair in social sciences and the humanities. Her scholarly and activist work centers on the intersections of race, gender, and violence, with a particular focus on the experiences of Black women and gender nonconforming people in relation to criminalization and state violence. She is the author of Arrested Justice and Compelled to Crime, a co-author of Abolition, Feminism Now, alongside Angela Davis, and the editor of The Long Term, among many other contributions to Black feminist scholarship and the movement to free criminalized survivors. Her work has been recognized with many honors, and she is a proud member of the 2022 cohort of the Annie E. Casey Foundation Freedom Scholars. You're in for it tonight, kids. It's my distinct honor to welcome Dr. Kimberlé Crenshaw and Dr. Beth Richie to FAN and ETHS.
Unusual, beautiful May evening in Chicago, and people came out to listen to us.
On a Friday.
So, what a good job I have. I am going to start by saying how delighted I am, Kimberlé, to be in this conversation with you this evening. You all know this, but I do feel like I have to say your visionary leadership, your commitments, your the way you've sort of spanned the landscape from a Black feminist perspective, you really are occupying the place in the world that we want to build. And as an abolitionist, I'm always looking to see what kind of world we can build. You're a North Star, and your influence keeps growing. So thank you for all that you've done. And happy belated birthday. Happy birthday. We won't sing, but we're feeling your birthday energy. Good timing with the release of the book.
Yeah.
Your book came right on time. We are all yearning to know what the heck we're supposed to be doing right now. And to have something that we can hold matters. It certainly matters to me a great deal. So I'm going to start by saying a few personal things, but mostly I want to frame this conversation with you, Kim, as an opportunity for us to think about how we need to be trained up as backtalkers. We need to know how to do this more. We need to know how to do it because of the war, because of fascism, because of violence, and we need to do it because we sometimes forget that we can be backtalkers, right? And we have to remind ourselves of that. But I do want to say a few personal things. First of all, thank you all for attending. Thank you to the Family Action Network. Thank you to the Evanston Township High School for the people who do the labor to make this place look the way it does. And thank you to the publishers, all the people who make you get to where you need to be. And you've been a lot of places, so maybe you can tell us a little bit about all of that. But I want to start by talking about our relationship for a minute. We have had a long and deep relationship. Both of us born and raised in Northeast Ohio, 2 years apart. And in many ways, your stories about growing up as a Black girl child that you start the book with feel wonderfully familiar to me. And then we both found ourselves as students at Cornell University, moving through similar spaces as Black women students, exciting, challenging place and time, the late 1970s, early 1980s. You chronicle it so vividly. I was sort of back at, on the campus, I was in the COSEP office. I was remembering the anthem that we had, Ain't No Stopping Us Now. We sang that walking through Ujima House and all of that. Just this past Tuesday, I had lunch with a Cornell friend, and we were remembering you from being, Juliana, remembering you in that place and time. And then we were together in New York City. African American women in defense of ourselves. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Strategizing about ending violence in the lives of Black women. I remember meeting you and hearing you talk about mapping the margins. Mapping the margins, if you haven't read it, have to read it. It was one of the first times that we saw on paper an analysis of violence against Black women and girls. We worked together on Kimba Smith's case. Just a range of places that we were, academic conferences in the Bay, porches in Oak Bluffs. We were, I think, at some parties together, maybe some house parties up near Columbia. You know, back in the day, we had house parties.
And our favorite bar.
Yeah, our favorite bar, yeah. I think we were watching we were watching playoffs,
Exactly.
I think, together, right? Anyway, the connection is deep. And I say that because part of what we're going to talk about today is not only your accomplishments, but also the person that you are, because that's the story of this in many ways, right? I just also want to say it's not only historical. Recently, Kathy and I, my partner, Kathy and I, who you know, of course, we're looking at the syllabus of our daughter's classes for next year. We got a sneak preview. We don't get a lot from her, but we got a sneak preview of one of her American Studies classes, and Backtalker's on the syllabus. Top of the list, yeah. Top of the list, yeah. So anyway, reading your memoir made me feel like I was on this delightful trip down memory lane. The places that you traveled, and you know, there were a lot of things I knew, and then of course things I didn't know. And anyone who hasn't read it, but you will when you leave here, you're going to feel this sense of familiarity. There's a real inviting way that you have asked us to enter into your process of your academic and your political and your activist process of being a backtalker. For that, I'm really grateful. And it's very much about how the book is written. But most of you probably came not to hear about my trip down memory lane, but instead to hear a little bit about Backtalk, an American memoir. So the first and probably most obvious place to start is for you to tell us what a backtalker is, how you became one, why you continue to be one, because you've been one for a while, right, even before the book came out. And then I want to hear a little bit about the subtitle. I want to hear about why this is an American memoir. Why don't you start by reading a little bit from the book about what a backtalker is? Yeah.
All right. So I want to say something personal before we get started. One of the most exciting things about being on a book tour is that I get to see some of my friends that I haven't seen for a while. But this is also a Backtalkers Unite moment, right? So I have been fortunate to be able to choose the people who I'm going to be in conversation with. And it is an opportunity for us both as backtalkers to talk about the frame, to talk about what we're backtalking against, and thankfully to answer questions together. So thank you so much, Beth. You have been a lodestar for me. I don't even remember anymore exactly when we started backtalking together, but I just know chapter, line, and verse, there's always been Beth as part of the chorus we've been singing in. So thank you so much. So I'm going to start with actually a note from Kim. And I think it'll be somewhat self-explanatory how and why I became a backtalker. So before we get started, I have a confession to make. Being a backtalker is like being lactose intolerant. There are some things that I just cannot digest. To accept anything close to second-class status as the price of belonging sickens me. I learned this the hard way during my first year at Harvard Law School when I bent and scraped my way into voluntary humiliation. It happened at the Fly Club, the prestigious home of elite Harvard men, including former presidents, captains of industry, and scions of wealthy families. Ben, who was the first African-American member of this exclusive club and a study partner, invited me and Reese, a third member of our all-black study group, to join him to celebrate the end of our first semester. Now, from what Reese and I had heard about the club's safari-decorated interiors and its exclusionary history, we both agreed that in the likely event that something unwelcoming occurred, we were not going to take any stuff. Our dignity was a non-negotiable condition of our presence in that space. Duly bonded, we arrived at the venue and knocked at the door to announce our arrival. Ben opened the door but stepped outside, blocking our entry into the club. Assuming that this was the beginning of the indignities we were not going to tolerate, Reese and I immediately assumed the trigger position, arms crossed, brows furrowed. Our friend, sensing our readiness to rumble, sought to de-escalate the situation with what he thought was a minor detail. "Oh, it's not what you think. I just forgot to mention that Kim needs to go around to the back door," he explained. "Women aren't permitted to enter through the front door." Now, in my mind, whether my backdoor treatment was because I was a woman or because I was a black person made no difference in our mutual defense pact. But for Reese, solidarity applied only to the things that were going to affect us both in the same way. Presumably, racial exclusion of both of us fit the bill, but the gender exclusion of me did not. Worse still, Reese and Ben plainly expected me not to make a scene. I stood there momentarily frozen, both by the realization that they would not stand up for me to be treated as their equal, and by my own fear that they would judge me harshly for insisting that they do. Their plea for me to behave reflected a familiar expectation to pledge allegiance to a flag of solidarity that didn't pledge the same to me. Now, a stronger me might have refused to dance to this unrelentingly asymmetrical tune. But at that point in my life, my commitments to the we ran deep, perhaps because there were only so many battles anyone could wage and still feel that she had a home. For whatever reason, I relented. I watched myself go around to the back door, consoled only by my insistence that they'd enter through the back door with me. Entering that club on such terms was a fateful decision. Whatever I drank there that night made me violently ill. My head was spinning all night, and my churning stomach urged me to leave a token of my indignity all over the understated interiors of the club's game room. I managed to hold myself together long enough to stomp loudly down the stairs and out the front door, slamming it so violently that I hoped it would break. Back in my dorm room, I made a deal with the universe that if the room would stop spinning, I would never, ever again come close to imbibing what I'd consumed that night, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Perhaps because my humiliation that night was punctuated by physical illness, My resistance to asymmetric solidarities is now fully reflexive. I cannot bring myself to ride or die for politics that won't ride or die for me. I've been called a public intellectual because I fashioned some words you may have heard about, like intersectionality or critical race theory. But if your vision of an intellectual brings to mind the thinker's pose, one with the chin in hand who ponders abstract ideas and with the light bulb suddenly flashing overhead writes down her epiphany, that's not me at all. My thinking starts from the bottom up, from interactions with people and experiences across my entire life that have made me feel some type of way. It's a feeling that tells me to pay attention, to ask some questions, and to struggle to put into words something that needs to be said. That's what these stories are. Memory is, of course, faulty, and perspective further shades what any of us can reliably recall. I've been aided in reconstructing these stories by faded handwriting in my childhood diaries, the loopy cursive in my bank of journals, by the yellowed clippings and scratchy recordings about the events that I've been part of, and by walks down memory lane with many companions who are part of this journey. In the end, this book is not an argument, a treatise, or even a defense of my life's work, but rather a set of stories about how I make sense of the life I've lived and the thinking that that life has inspired. The Fly Club episode has become my lodestar, the encounter that navigates my thinking, that disciplines my desire to be desired, to be part of that club, or to be the belle of the ball. But there are times when I walk by many of the Fly Clubs in my mind's eye that I catch a glimpse of my wannabe alter ego, the one who never regretted going through that back door and has had many a great time being toasted by those who offered only conditional inclusion. As I gaze into the window of that alternate reality, feeling a momentary flight of indecision, I sometimes wonder whether the costs of backtalking are worth remaining on the outside looking in. And then my stomach churns, and I remember that the drinks in there suck anyway.
The book is full of those kinds of stories. I mean, there's stories that we can relate to on so many levels, and your sharing of them in such a deep, honest, and personal way is what makes, by the end of the book, if you didn't start out wanting to be a backtalker, you will be by the end, because you take us on that journey with you. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about your family influences that led you to backtalking. And in particular, well, let me say, on the one hand, you talk about your family kind of in the way that we are in Black families. They're kind of traditional family dynamics around gender sometimes and generation. Everybody has their role. Mm-hmm. And yet, it's also a Black story. So there's also the ways that race people have to learn how to, when to, if to backtalk. And I'm particularly interested in you talking about how that kind of shaped you as a child, and maybe anything in particular about your mother as a model for backtalking, some of the things that she did to inspire that.
Yeah. So in many ways, this book is a tribute to my family. I don't have any of them with me anymore, in the physical plane, but they are in me. They set the path for me. And so I revel in the stories and the recollections of how they did it and when they did it. So the first thing to know about my family is my parents were both educators. They were musicians. they used music as their instrument for preaching the ideals of racial harmony in the middle of the 60s. So they both had several choirs, but the main one that they directed and traveled all over the Northeast with was called the Canton Police Club's Boys Choir. And my father was a brilliant vocalist, and my mother was a musician who played several instruments. My brother sang in the choir, and I turned the pages. So it was a whole family affair. Behind the scenes, it's important to know that they were a perfect marriage between my father's sort of Martin Luther King orientation and my mom, who was the Malcolm X, right? And so together, I got both the kind of ecumenical, spiritual, humanistic kind of way of reading other people and the structures that we are in, the best way to go about navigating them. And on my mom's side, I could just say she was all about show them who you're dealing with. Don't take any stuff. And so between the two of them, I had both strains of what was a dominant, sensibility in the 60s. Now, as educators, they didn't walk off the job when they came home. The dinner table was another classroom, for my brother and me. So our friends used to tease us that we had to stop playing a little bit early to do homework for dinner, because at the table we were expected to talk about what we had observed in the world, what we thought about what we had observed in the world, what we learned from what we observed in the world. So for them, living wasn't just about letting things happen to you. It was about active interaction with the world that you found yourself in, the space that you occupied, the place in which you were born. So I was encouraged to talk back to the world from the earliest that I can remember. So, talking was a big deal because they were a little worried. My first babysitter didn't talk much, and apparently I started talking late. And so they were deeply concerned about this. So they fired my babysitter and had my grandmother raise me. And for the rest of my life, they talked about what a mistake that had been, because once my grandmother got me talking, apparently I kind of never stopped. And this is the other kind of funny thing there. So they were both musicians, and I think my mother often, fell hard for people who could sing really well. She was a great musician, but she could not sing. And I think she very much wanted me to get that gene from my father. And try as I might, I cannot sing. I cannot do it. And so I used to pout and cry because my best friend could really sing, and my mother was, I was thinking, you just like Tina because she could sing. And she would say to me, don't worry, baby, you can talk. And I was like, what good is talking going to give me? It was such a consolation prize. But so much of what was happening in the world gave us a rich sort of smorgasbord of things to talk about at the dinner table. And in doing that, they encouraged me even to challenge sometimes the things that they were saying. Now, if it would get too far, they would shut it down. But I got a few rounds in before the, sort of the parental because I say so, kicked in. And that told me that I had gotten somewhere, when they were no longer resorting to explanation or to logic, but simply, okay, because I'm the parent. I'm like, okay, well, if that's the rule, then it's just authority here. But yeah, that's where most of it came from. And then as I grew older, and for reasons that are still difficult to imagine, they sent me to a fundamentalist Christian school that gave me a lot to talk back to, because These were schools that were started in the 60s, partly for white parents to avoid desegregation. And my parents just didn't understand that the fact that it was a Christian school didn't mean it was an anti-racist school. They didn't get that until I started coming home and telling them things. And so at the dinner table, we would work out what it meant that, I don't know, I was accused of stealing something, what it meant that my health teacher was saying that Revelations was nigh because, the civil rights activists were demonic and, the rapture was coming. I mean, just crazy stuff. But that was the laboratory, and the school and the neighborhood, that was the place where the skills that were learned at the dinner table were exercised.
Yeah. Beautiful stories about your family. And I think I met your mom. You did? Yeah. So her presence there was very strong. And of course, I've heard the stories about your brother and your father, too. I'm wondering if you think there's anything distinctively Black or feminist or even activist lawyer-like about backtalking. And I admitted to Kimberly when we were in the back that sometimes I use black talking. I know it's back talking, so if I slip into black talking, but I wonder if you think there's anything that is distinctively Black or feminist or lawyer-like.
For one, a lot of Black folks I know who have talked to me about the title have started with, now when we were growing up, to backtalk would get you in trouble. Right. And I don't know if backtalking is as widely understood outside the Black community, is it? So it's a Southern thing? Yeah. So back talking is the idea that you don't talk back to authority, you don't question it, you don't doubt it, you basically go along with it, even though you actually know or have a strong sense that what is being told to you isn't 100% right. It doesn't matter whether it's 100% right. You're supposed to toe the line. And it's very much a part of the idea that the hierarchy from which your instruction is coming is so solid and secure that it doesn't matter that what you're being told makes no sense, or it is marginalizing or humiliating. The hierarchy comes first, and your commitment to it often means stay silent. So it very much seemed to me that what was happening in the 60s is that Black folk were challenging that. Black folks were back-talking. The civil rights movement was back-talking. So, fast forward, of course, we have a moment now in which authoritarianism is infantilizing us in the same way that children are told not to talk back. So I wanted to use it as basically a metaphor for shaping, first of all, the fact that there is a hierarchy in place, and we are expected to abide by that hierarchy. And so backtalking is fundamentally a call to resist, resist and not be silent, say what we need to say in order to make the hierarchy itself illegitimate. Now, the specific way in which I think my parents got on that sort of wave in the 20th century was that both of their parents were what is called race men and women. By that, I mean, Black families who both railed against and refused to internalize the hierarchy and used their various assets to circumvent it, contest it, refuse to take the knee to it. And that sort of got passed on from one generation to another. So I talk in the book about how my mother integrated her local swimming pool at 3 and what my grandmother did, when they drained the pool on her. I talk about how, the local theater segregated by making black people sit in the peanut gallery, and she refused and actually sued. This is something that has been so amazing in doing the research on the book. I have been told all these stories for my whole life. Your grandfather wrote a letter to the editor when they had a picture of 3 black boys in front of a big watermelon with some stupid thing. And he wrote a letter and they apologized. I heard about that. I heard about the root beer stand that wouldn't serve them in the frosty glass mugs, but only in paper cups. I'd heard about it. And I'd been told that my grandfather took in Ohio, segregation was not required. It wasn't legally imposed. In fact, we had public accommodations that protected us against it, but segregation in Ohio, like I'm sure other places, was more by custom, by law. So my grandfather printed out cards of the Ohio Public Accommodations Code to give to my mother. So whenever she encountered something like this, she would she would quote the law. And if they insisted on doing that, then they basically had an open and shut case. So they were telling me, yeah, we sued that place, we sued that. And I'm like, yeah, okay. And then when I'm doing the research for the end pages and I typed my grandparents' name, my mother's name into the search engine, all of these like articles and tiny little notices in the newspaper came up. So I got the microfiche and started going through it, and in the classifieds would be these little notices, judgment, $400 to Pearl and Marion Williams. Judgment, $600 to Dr. Williams. Like, they actually did that stuff. And there is an archive. So even in my own mind, though I believe them, the movement from the sort of misty, when we were kids, this is what happened, to actually having the artifact makes all the difference in the world.
So important. And, when I sort of saw the title as like a reclaiming almost of the power, the importance, and the obligation of backtalking. Not the punishment that sometimes came when we were accused of backtalking in some spaces, but it's actually like taking the irreverence and making it part of what you are obligated to do. That's the sense I got from reading about how your family at those dinner tables and in those places so encouraged you to do it. You talk about your evolution to becoming a backtalker through these life experiences that you've just shared, your experiences of anti-Black racism, of gender violence, of the places where you were denied or excluded. It's a lot about how you came to backtalking as a political strategy from the lived experience, which is so important. And in that way, the book is a real kind of personal connection to a political moment. I taught a course this semester where we read Black women's memoirs. And it's such a consistent message across from Assata Shakur to reading about Joanne Little, like the ways that we take personal experiences and make them political acts. And we come up with intellectual and academic strategies. That's right. Things like intersectionality and critical race theory. And I'm wondering if you can talk about, for the audience that doesn't know what intersectionality is, and maybe a little bit about what critical race theory is, how are those manifestations of backtalking to a theory, backtalking to an analysis, an institution, to a profession, to the academy, how you took your backtalking life experience and turned them into these things that are so important to those of us in the academy and trying to live in the world. Can you connect backtalking to those things?
Starting with the memoir that you talk about, I'm very interested in thinking through how even Backtalker is a subtype of memoir that, first of all, does what many Black critical thinkers have long done with their memoir. It's not just a story of personal discovery or coming of age. These memoirs are reflections on coming of age, recognizing the process by which the structure that we were born into actually shapes our lives, and then our consciousness around that shaping that led to resistance. And I see this as being part of that genre, and perhaps being part of a subgenre of taking up and centering the law and its institutions as part of the structure that, sometimes appears invisible, but is nonetheless the product of choice, the project of, institutions making decisions that shape who we are, right? So, there's a whole way in which in the field of academe, we talk about how race is socially constructed. If that is the case, our memoirs are actually showing that. And this one is trying to show it through denaturalizing the law, by challenging how the law actually was functioning in the 60s, 70s to shape our experience. And so the back-talking that led to critical race theory intersectionality was in part a product of the longer arc of back-talking in higher education, which we both were fortunate to have gone to a university where students back-talked against the failure of an institution like Cornell to actually do anything other than admit us. That's it. Right? They didn't move the furniture in any way. They didn't change anything that was going on in that university, and really patted themselves on the back to think, yeah, we're doing something here. When in fact the university is as much a site of illegitimate racial power as the voting booth was. But it was never seen that way. So we inherited the legacy of students who, were a half generation above us, who said, you know what, we're not taking this anymore. These are the ways that if you are to educate us, a group of people who have been rationalized as, legitimately outside of this institution, you have to actually go to the core of the mission. You have to look at the way that education happens here, the way that socialization happens here. So, we go to Cornell and there's COSEP, which is, a great program to integrate us into this space. There's Africana Studies, which is literally on the outside of campus. It took me a long time before I knew what dialectical meant, but I was doing it, because I was in those crazy government classes that were basically justifying things like urban renewal, and removing so-called urban blight, which from my experience was, no, that's when they came and took mom's houses and property. So I was able to understand how the university created knowledge systems that justified racial power, and then go to Africana Studies and learn the critical frameworks that allowed us to read what that was with a critical eye. So coming out of Cornell with that back and forth kind of double consciousness, by the time I got to Harvard Law School, I wasn't thinking that the law was some kind of magic. I kind of knew that that wasn't the deal, right? What I didn't know was how to talk back to it. I was going to study with Derek Bell, and Derek Bell decided to leave, right before we got there. So some part of talking back was truly from our need to contest the exclusion of this knowledge and the refusal to use the need to hire people to teach us this knowledge as a pipeline for scholars of color. And they basically just told us flat out, there aren't any qualified people of color to come here. I mean, it was just raw like that. And that was the best thing to happen to me because, you know, it's one thing to see a picture and the justification for it is silent. It's another thing to see a picture and they tell you the reason it looks like that is because none of y'all can do this. And we're like, okay, so tell us how you've come to that conclusion. And when they have to explain the rationale, you see clearly the racial disempowerment in the rationale. So what did you need to be a Harvard law professor? Well, first of all, you had to go to Harvard or maybe Yale at a time where they were not really big on admitting us to go to Harvard. So that should have been the end of it right there, but they weren't done. They went on to say, and while you're here, you need to, you know, strike up a relationship between, you know, yourself and a professor, and basically you do that based on a common interest in the work that they're doing. Well, nobody was working on work that was of any interest to any of us, so that was a cutoff. Then you have to be hired by a Supreme Court justice. Well, at that time, there were probably exactly 3 black people who had ever been hired by a Supreme Court justice ever, and then you have to work at, you know, a blue chip law firm. They weren't even hiring like the 1 or 2 people who graduated at the top of their class worked for, you know, a Supreme Court. So effectively, merit meant be like us, and the first way that you have to be like us is to be a white male. It was just, it was a racially specific distribution that was wrapped around language of race neutrality. There was nothing neutral about it. So our talking back began with taking apart their rationale and then saying, we're not going to accept what you're doing. That very year, they hired 10 white men. 10. So we rejected that. We rejected some of the things they offered. We created a boycott. We created an alternative course. And that alternative course drew scholars of color from across the country to teach 1 chapter out of Derek Bell's book for 12 weeks. 4 years later, when I invited 30 scholars to a convent in Wisconsin to talk about what was critical about the work that we were all doing, nearly half of them had been involved in some way in the alternative course. So that was talking back to the justifications that legitimized our exclusion from higher education. And intersectionality just grew out of that. Then I became interested in understanding how the law dealt with the challenges that black women were making at the time to being excluded from lots of industries. As is typically the case, particularly in the 70s and the 80s, many industrial concerns were segregated by race and segregated by gender, which meant that jobs for whites and blacks were different. Black people tended to work in the floor, in the dangerous jobs, framed as unskilled, and white men were working above them. Women's jobs tended to be secretaries, receptionists, front office jobs. So these places were hiring women and they were hiring black people, but the women they were hiring were not black, and the black people they were hiring were not women. And so when black women wanted to challenge that, they ran into the buzzsaw of the erudite judges in their everlasting wisdom who said, you can't prove gender discrimination because we do hire women, and you can't prove race discrimination because we do hire black people. It made no sense that they refused to allow black women to put 2 causes of action together to actually explain why they weren't being hired there. And to add insult to injury, they said, for us to allow you to make a compound claim when we don't allow black men or white women to do it would give you preferential treatment. Now, of course, black women were the only ones at that point who needed to put the two causes of action together to actually explain the discrimination. But these really smart judges didn't realize how stupid that was. So I was trying to just figure out a framework, a metaphor, something that allows them to see that power isn't just two parallel tracks, that power and the structures through which power flows can actually overlap. They can, their interface can create something that's bigger and different than just experiencing racism here and sexism over there. So an intersection just seemed to be an obvious way of getting them to move away from their separate, mutually exclusive understandings of discrimination and see it as interactive. So it was really a legal concept that then sort of jumped the rails and traveled outside of law and outside of race and gender and outside of the academy and outside of the United States. That was talking back to illogical and exclusionary frameworks that very powerful people were holding on to without good reason. And at the end of the day, without the framework, would have been more difficult to show the discrimination in their interpretation of discrimination.
Right. So, any of you who study, I know some of you do, and use intersectionality, critical race theory, the way you describe it, it's as if like, well, of course this just came because it just made so much sense, which it does, and you really do talk about it in great detail in the book, but I do feel like it's important to sort of pause and say, those are brilliant things, and you're right, they have traveled far beyond what just sort of made logical sense to you as you were thinking about your experience at Harvard as a law student, and then out in the world trying to think about how legal cases are framed. And so part of what is so moving to me about the book is the way that you describe things that make so much sense and seem so logical, that have become so profoundly influential to so many of us in terms of how we understand the world. So that's appreciation, and also just sort of the pause of how it just sort of came from your lived experience. I do have a lot of other questions, but I want to do two more quick things with you before we open it up. One is, one interpretation of Kimberlé Crenshaw is the pedigree, the Cornell, the Harvard, the people you met, the Toni Morrison, the Angela Davis, the Derek Bell, the Luke Harris, the people you walked with and studied with and learned from and influenced, and the critical race theory and intersectionality. And then there's the activist and advocate that you are, that you've been, and the way you've changed the world in that way. The defense of Anita Hill, the organizing of African American women in defense of ourselves. This is a teaser, read the book. The founding of the African American Policy Forum, the Say Her Name and Black Girls Matter campaign, the new Backtalkers Academy. So there's a whole line of your legacy in the world of activism and advocacy that I think is important, because it's not separate, really, from the academic work. But I can't ask you to talk about that, because there's another question I want to ask you before we open it up. Read the book, because if you don't know, the way that you have bridged the increasingly distant space between the academy and the real world where people are dying is critically important. And those campaigns are just some of the many examples of that. Sorry, I answered the question.
Thank you.
Yeah. We can't leave the auditorium without some discussion about this moment. What are we going to do, Kim? We got some big problems facing us. It seems like, I'm sure in the hour that we've been sitting here, something else has happened. I'm sure of it. So between the Voting Rights Act and the Supreme Court decision, which of course wasn't a surprise, but is still astonishing, The violence against Black women, not new, but the high-profile cases and the way it's being framed and the attention to intimate partner violence and state violence. The U.S. supported wars from Palestine to the Sudan, the general erosion of democracy, DEI, fascism, the way our academic institutions, including some that you're connected to, mine too, all of them, but some more than others. The criminalization of protests and dissent. We are in a political mess, and it's getting worse by the moment. And yet, back-talking seems to be a process that's got some hope in it. I mean, we don't do it just to do it. We do it because we can't tolerate injustice. We must be. So it's a long question, but the short version of it is, how do you make sense of this time? What are we supposed to do? What gives us hope? And what would you offer to this audience in their everyday lives to take this new world that's really an old one and try to do something different?
Yeah. So I have clarity that gets more obscure as we get to the end of your questions. So how I make sense out of this, that's kind of clear to me. I make sense out of it by understanding that, as Langston Hughes was wont to say, you don't have to tell the Negro about fascism. We know it. The challenge is that for, I would say, at least the last 10 years in which we've been on this pathway, the conversation about the threat of fascism and the collapse of democracy has proceeded without a conversation about the collapse of anti-racism and the collapse of feminism, right? So it's as though these are two different problems. And for some people, there is a hierarchy in which of these problems and how we can address these. So intersectionality is clearly not part of it, partly because intersectionality is only about that race thing. And of course, race is, for some sort of pro-democracy people, race is the thing that actually muddies the water. Race is the thing that got us this current White House and this current Congress. Race is a thing that we cannot afford to talk about if we want to claw back our democracy. And I think the opposite is the case. Race is the thing that we cannot not talk about. And if that wasn't clear before last week, if that wasn't clear before what they're doing in Tennessee right now, I don't know when it's ever going to be clear. Absolutely. I have no understanding of that. The second thing, which is, obviously where the Langston Hughes and Toni Morrison, who was very clear about the different stages of this, she laid it out in the late 90s, right? You create an other group. You pull together culture and knowledge and expertise to reinforce the othering of that group. Then you do things to the othered group that establishes the precedent and the policies and the practice so that then it is freely available to be exercised against other groups. And when you just think about the broad history of this country, there's not a moment that I don't look at ICE and think about the slave patrols. There's not a moment, right, when it's not 100% clear to me that the deep grooves of inhumanity that have been created in this society are constantly there and available to be resurrected and utilized against the people that it was initially used against and anybody and everybody else. So this is a moment of historical return to older forms of exercising tyranny, racialized tyranny, that then sets the stage for it to be applied to absolutely everybody. I often hear myself in meetings where, allies are talking about what we're going to do for the midterms and what we're going to do, for, the presidential election. And of course we have to, think about these as the last opportunities that we have to slow the deterioration of our democracy. But this is not a game for the next 2 years or the next 4 years. We're talking about the next century, if not beyond that. So never forget, look, we had 8 years where this country actually tried to make a go at creating a true multiracial democracy. 8 years. It was overthrown by some of the same tactics that are happening right now. And we didn't recapture the possibility for 7 decades. That's potentially what we're looking at right now. So that's why I said I'm clear about how I'm thinking about this moment. Now, what we do about it, that's when it gets a little, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago, I could have said, we have got to defend the vote. We have got to defend freedom of intellectual pursuit. We've got to shore up the universities. We've got to move corporate dollars off of the boards of universities. We've got to shore up independent journalism. I'd have said all that 10 years ago when that was a possibility. That's kind of gone now, right? And we are seeing the consequences of universities no longer being led by its mission, but by people largely who never were educators, don't understand the mission, and are willing to compromise and negotiate the fundamental mission of universities. So we have that. We have the media that effectively allow for the right-wing media to serve as a heckler's veto to anything the rest of us would want. So, and let me just say, when Claudine Gay was deposed, and I use that because I think that's what that was, they are very clear and have bragged about how they did it. We plant a story in the media that we can control. We rehearse it and repeat it and rehearse it until it gets taken up by the mainstream media as a story. The mainstream media do not investigate, interrogate. They just say, hey, they're saying this over here, and these people here are saying the opposite, you decide. It's kind of like saying the sun rises in the west, these other people say, you decide. There's no, real function. So as a consequence of that, the campaign to remove women and people of color, and as one of the Trump administration officials has clearly said, if you want to get anything done, you have to have white men to do it. Right. A while ago, that would have been prima facie case of racism. Yeah. Now it's more of the same. So I don't know what to say about the things that we could have done. What I am left with is that there's only one thing that we know for sure. That is, if we don't talk back, if we don't fight this, if we don't collectivize our fighting back, if we keep thinking we can pivot away from the crises by changing what we call things, by scrubbing our websites, by saying, oh no, we don't teach that anymore, that is not working. Because what they're coming for is not what we call things, it's what we're doing. And that's what we need to talk back.
Yeah. Thank you. Good answer. Thank you so much.